Imagine a world where hidden data systems are making decisions that affect your life and you can't see the math behind them. The marriage of big data and algorithm has had serious consequences, and they're called weapons of math destruction. And we'll explore how to protect your family today. So, congratulations for investing in your family's future today by joining us on AI Parenting Live. We're a judgment free community moving from screen time to quality time. And our motto is don't sedate, relate to create. And today we're going to lift the curtain on big data by exposing the disturbing reality behind its use through the book Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil. This book takes a look at the algorithms and equations that shape our lives, from education, criminal justice, and hiring decisions to how people get priced for their insurance and what kind of deals we get recommended on Amazon. So the three main topics that we'll explore today are: 1, algorithms in hiding; 2, critical thinking; and 3, gaming the system. So ready to dive into it? Excellent. And of course, if you have any questions for me, feel free to ask them in the chat. I am here to answer any questions. Questions for Dr. Ed. So feel free to put any questions that you have for me into the chat. Perfect. So the first one. Let's see. Yes, algorithms in hiding. So I'm going to share 3 ways that algorithms hide in plain sight. The first is to stop the creepiness, but not the creeping. The second is targeting specific groups of people. And the third is the mathematical magic show. So in my series called Who Created Our Artificial Intelligence? Let me make sure. Oh, yes. Okay, excellent. In my series called Who Created Our Artificial Unconsciousness, I spoke about how people like Target Dad found the recommendations of AI creepy, and this resulted in the need for AI recommendations to be hidden among other ads so it didn't raise suspicion. So this first method is called stop the creepiness, but not the creeping. This is how the algorithms hide. And maybe I'll hide the slides here. Keep in mind, history repeats itself. And even before Target Dad, we had, oh, hi, Alice. Excellent. So even before Target Dad, there was already a history of hiding data and algorithms that automatically makes decisions that has a profound impact on our lives. And this is what Cathy O'Neil refers to as weapons of math destruction in her book. So in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which you can find on Amazon, you can click the link. Cathy, who is Cathy? Cathy was a data scientist for some of the largest hedge funds during the subprime mortgage crisis. And so she saw firsthand the impact of these mathematical models on people. And she felt compelled to write a book to help us understand what is really going on. And I am so thankful that she did, because I have learned so many insights from this book. It has been incredible. So if you haven't picked up this book, I highly recommend it. It's also available on Audible as well. I've enjoyed listening to the audiobook as well. So very, very interesting. So many workers are subject to weapons of math destruction, or WMDs, without even knowing it. Even if a worker doesn't use social media, or they don't use a freelancing AI like Fiverr or Upwork, they may have still taken an IQ test or a Big 5 personality test. Now, IQ tests were often used by employers to to determine whether or not people would be suitable for work. And it was only during the arrival of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, that this practice became of using IQ for employment became illegal. So this should be of no surprise to anybody who's a longtime listener like Alice. As we've seen with cookie tracking today, when the public becomes aware of weapons of math destruction, or WMDs, what typically happens is that lawyers or lawmakers, they argue to change the rules and regulations. But this does not mean that they stop using WMDs. Instead, they are often replaced with inferior, pseudo-anonymous systems that are even more harmful. Now, I previously talked about cookies being replaced by session IDs and then ultimately the federated learning of cohorts, where it just records this anonymous AI model of your unconscious desires. And the key is you have very little knowledge of what's recorded and even less ability to argue against the decisions that are made. So what happens over time is that things get worse rather than better. And so that is key. And ultimately, the other example, let's go back to the example of IQ tests. So IQ tests were replaced with job applicant screening systems like Kronos, which required potential candidates. So Kronos, Kronos. These systems required the potential candidates to do a Big Five personality test before they were considered for hiring. The Big Five personality test looks for extroversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Those are the Big Five. Now, the problem with these personality tests is that they heavily bias against the people who are low income or they are neuroatypical. For example, a recent Vanderbilt University grad was unable to even get a cashier job at the local supermarket, even though he had an outstanding GPA at a private research university. The reasons is that this grad was bipolar, and he found that his resume was red flagged by employers. And even when he applied to other jobs, he found that other employers had also red flagged his application. This grad likely scored worse for neuroticism, even though his performance in university was exemplary. Studies have shown that these tests like the Big Five personality tests, are worse predictors of employee performance than IQ tests. But since IQ tests are outlawed, employers have no choice but to use the next best WMD that produces good enough results. So the key with any model is that ability to improve it. For example, models are used in baseball to determine which stats are really important for the next draft pick. Let's say a player is passed up for a spot with the New York Mets and becomes the MVP for the Oakland A's. The people who are making that model would have to go back and look at why the model made this mistake. And they would have to improve their model. But the problem with many weapons of math destruction is that they make good enough decision to be useful for companies, and there isn't a financial incentive to improve them. So a baseball contract could be worth millions of dollars. But what's the cost of excluding some people from the hiring process? There's almost none. So can you see, like, this is why, like, they're called weapons of math destruction, is because, yeah, we could improve them, but there's no financial reason to do so. So I think that's key. Now, ultimately, public outrage seems to be one of the few ways that result in changes to WMDs. Any system that makes automatic decisions should be subject to some level of transparency, where do they get their data, and some level of scrutiny, whether the algorithms are representative of what we want to see in society. So let me see. Got a question from Alice. Alice asks, I've often wondered about these career predictor sites for students today. Is this kind of the same thing? So this is a very interesting question, because a lot of these algorithms, their job is to predict the future. It's to predict not only what your career will be, but what your grades are going to be, kind of moving on if everything went the same. So yes, they are similar systems. The key to a weapon of math destruction, as defined by Kathy, is that it has to collect a lot of data and has to make decisions that is going to have a big impact on your life. And it sounds to me like this is a perfect example. Like predicting what career you should go into is a perfect example of something that's going to have a big impact, but you don't understand how it works. And if it gives you the wrong prediction, it tells you, oh, you can't do this type of career. What is the impact of that? And so I think it fits the description of a WMD. Now, there's some good news. It's not all bad. The good news is that on April 21st this year, we saw proposed European Union legislation that required big tech companies to have more transparency and human oversight into high-risk AI systems. So these are high risk, I believe, is anything that is considered to make big decisions on you, like career decisions, things that would impact your life in a significant way. And, that's a good point. Another thing about them is that students generally trust them, right? Like if it gave you a career decision, it says, yeah, this is the best career for you, as said by the AI, you would tend to trust the result without questioning it. And this is the key for most of them, is most people do not question anything related to the AI systems. So very important. Okay, so the second way that algorithms hide is by targeting specific groups of people. And we already saw examples of this in the 2018 election. And this is we learned that, in the 2018 election, that fake news posts on social media was sufficient to stop specific communities of Black people from voting. And usually our desires are revealed through our searches and what we spend our time watching. This allows companies to target specific groups of people that are most likely to buy. Like we call it targeting in the market speak. Now, of course, these specific customer pain points can be easily searched for, and of course, the goal is to provide the quick fix nearby. And Kathy, in her book, says that desperation is gold. Consider educational loans. So the U.S. loans up to 90% of the tuition for colleges. And so companies spent billions in recruitment of the most vulnerable and the lowest self-esteem to take up university and collect this crippling debt. They would tout the prestige of attending a private university like DeVry compared to a local safe school, even though if you looked at the statistics, it showed that those from private universities made less money than those people who attended the local safe schools. Now, marketers did find that these ads didn't work well, or they didn't work as well on the wealthy. So they continued to target the poorest and the lowest self-esteem. Now, in the same way, subprime mortgages were marketed to church pastors as a way to afford a home for those with the lowest income, but at the highest lending rates. So it looks like they're trying to help you get a home, But the reality is these particular lending rates are like the worst that you can possibly get. Like you'd be better like going out to a bank, but maybe a bank won't accept you. So subprime is the only option for you. An example is a caretaker making less than $30,000 a year could take out a loan for $700,000 for a home to buy a home on speculation that the price would increase and that they could sell the home in a few years. When the housing crash came, these people had no choice but to default on their loan. So is that one making sense so far? So the two methods that I've covered so far, the first is the hiding underground. So it's just changing its name, it's changing its algorithm, it's stopping the creepiness, but not the creeping. And then the second way is by targeting very specific groups of people, because what happens is the news media generally doesn't hear about this because it's very specific and it wouldn't cover the kind of people who would work for the news media. So hope it makes sense so far. Okay, so the third way, and this is my favorite, is how they hide behind this mathematical magic show. So mathematics is often, and not just math, but math and technology is often used to impress clients rather than protect them against risk. And this was certainly the case for mortgage-backed securities during the housing crisis. The complexity of credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities was too complex for most people to understand at the time. You can imagine, it also created this false perception that these loans were safer under the label of a AAA rated loan. Now, these rating agencies knew that they didn't have a choice. They had to play ball. Otherwise, these same companies who were creating these financial instruments would bring their business to competitors for a better rating. They would just shop it around. But the problem was consumers were not aware of the magic that was happening behind the scenes. They were not aware of these ratings were effectively a rubber stamp. They were more like a rubber stamp than they were actually telling you about the quality of these ratings. Now, there were very little consequences for the companies whose WMD hurt large numbers of people. Many of the companies that sold subprime mortgages had already passed on the risk to other investors through mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps. Even years after the crisis, very little has changed in practice. If anything, most financial institutions felt emboldened that they were too big to fail. They now knew that with the right amount of lobbying, governments would bail them out. And so I hope this is making so far. Feel free to pop any questions in. This is the end of the part one. So the summary is there are three things. So one is stopping the creepiness. So the ways that algorithms hide. So just as a quick review, this one. So the ways that algorithms hide. The first one is they stop the creepiness, but not the creeping. The second is they target specific groups of people. And then the third is they use mathematical magic, which is kind of a way of saying they make it so complicated that, most people won't understand. And that's one of the ways that they hide. Okay. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the comments. Happy to answer them anytime. That's one of the reasons why we're live, just so that it's a little bit more interactive. Okay, so the next one is about critical thinking. So almost 40 years ago, President Ronald Reagan delivered a report known as The Nation at Risk that stated from 1963 to 1980, SAT scores had been declining in the United States. The report blamed teachers for the decline and called for a commission to assess the quality of teaching and learning at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary levels. One of the authors, James J. Harvey, wrote the now famous quote, "Our educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might as well have viewed it as an act of war." This is the actual quote, an act of war. Very, very strong words. But here's the problem. These words sound so convincing. It feels like, wow, that's really bad. He's totally right. Things are worse. And it was factual that SAT scores had declined. However, the report itself, it was so profound. It fundamentally changed education in the United States. But it was flawed to begin with. While it was true that SAT scores were declining during that time, much of the decline was just due to lower income students also taking up the SAT exams when they would never actually do it. So the Department of Energy brought in their best statisticians from Sandia Laboratory Systems. They brought in their systems scientists who looked at the average SAT scores among different income brackets. And they found that SAT scores had increased in every income bracket between the periods of 1963 and 1980. So this is the problem, is the scores were actually increasing for every income bracket, but if you took them all together, then the actual score was lower overall. I believe this is called the Simpsons paradox in the book, but without going into too much detail, it's our lack of critical thinking that caused this assumption that things were really bad. So I think that's the way I see things is really, it's really concerning. So numbers are often used to demonstrate that decisions are made based on facts. They're objective and they shouldn't be questioned. But without the ability to critically think about the numbers, most of the population will just believe what numbers are given to them. And they won't think to question those numbers. And this is why the poorest and most vulnerable are most at risk of being left behind by systems like AI. We need data transparency and the right to ask how these mathematical decisions are made. Another example, let's go back to that example with teachers. Teachers in Texas were evaluated using a WMD known as the value added model. It looks at students' past test scores to predict the same students' future test scores. So if they're progressing on this path, they should be getting these types of grades in the future. And the results were assumed. So basically, they would predict where they would go, and if it varied, the variation in that result was assumed to be the result of the teacher and the school, rather than, say, the students' abilities or their family's socioeconomic status. Like all of these very, very important factors completely ignored in the system, again, because there isn't a lot of critical thinking when it comes to these WMDs. The example that I loved from the book was a Texas primary teacher was embarrassed about his 2 out of 100 score. He was too embarrassed to share it with his colleagues until he was in the lunchroom and he overheard others had received the same score. Now, for him, his tenure and his relationships that were built over time had saved him. But this WMD has real implications when decisions were made to fire the bottom 2% of all teachers each year. So a good teacher in a poor neighborhood would become collateral damage of this weapon of math destruction. Now, an interesting, what is this all about? Oh, hi, Ali. So your question is, what is this all about? So we are reading a book. We're doing a book review on something called Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. It's a fascinating book that is all about learning about why certain types of algorithms or certain types of things control our society. And I'm just doing a review on it because I just finished reading it, and I love this book. And so it's something that I'm highly recommending for anybody that hasn't seen it. But thanks for your question. Appreciate it. So, the interesting things, the story about this teacher was that, ironically, the following year, the same teacher that got 2 out of 100 got 94 out of 100 score simply by teaching a class of regular students. You see, what happened was he concluded that the poor score on the first year was due to his work with special educational need, or SEN students, and he also worked with gifted and talented education, or GATE students. So the SEN students had slower progress during the year, and the GATE students were already scoring really high, so they're going to make less progress as well. So they're expected to go really fast, but they're going really slow, slower than average. And that was blamed on the teacher. And so you can see, like, this it screwed it up. And I think to Alice, yeah, like I thought the same way. I was like, wow, really? This happens too? Absolutely. It does, 100%. So handling exceptions, it remains something that we need to rely on people to do. This is what makes weapons of math destruction so dangerous for our society. It's not just stripping away reality from the model, but it's also stripping away our humanity from the model as well. Like, if this were in a real world scenario, you could speak to somebody and you could say, like, come on, like, this isn't reasonable. Look at my situation. Of course, this is going to make less progress. And you can't fire me because of this. But often people don't have those types of insights. They don't get that type of understanding. So how do we fight back? Well, let's look at how people game the system. I love this. I love gaming the system. But before I continue, is this sinking in so far? Am I making sense? Like, drop in the comments if it's making sense so far. Yeah, I appreciate any sense so far. Yeah, perfect. I appreciate the insights. Okay, so this last part, and this is something that I'm quite interested in. I think this is how we fight back, at least from my reading of the book. So I mentioned that when it comes to gaming the system, I mentioned that the problem with models is that they're only an approximation of the real world. And as a result, if you know the model, you can game the system. Have you ever looked at university rankings? The annual US News college and university rankings are often a top priority for many colleges and universities. How do I find you on Amazon Live? Oh, that's a great question. I think if you go to Amazon Live, I will have to send you a link to it afterwards. Alice, no problem. Yes. Oh, cancel. I'm gonna switch that right now. Yeah, I'll send you a link to it afterwards. Sorry. So WMDs, like the U.S. News ranking, and my understanding is that Kathy considers the U.S. News University ranking, the one that ranks all universities globally and in the United States. It creates unfair systems that don't always benefit the broader society. And if we just revisit that U.S. News example, the original evaluation, like when it was originally created, the numbers didn't come out quite right. So what they did is they kept tweaking the metrics that they would use until the Ivy League universities bubbled up to the top, because there was this assumption that, okay, if the Ivy Leagues are on the top, that means that this ranking is correct. And so what they had to do in order to fix the ranking system, it kind of meant that the university ranking, WMD, would focus heavily on research publications, technology, innovation, and ultimately the success of their graduates. But what it did not consider is just as interesting as what it did consider. They would not consider the cost of tuition, and they would not consider the return on their education, the income return on their education, or it's called ROE for short. And so the result is a ranking system. So the US News is a wonderful ranking system for the top 1%, for which the cost of a college or university is largely irrelevant. But it hurts the other 99% who cannot afford to attend universities at any arbitrary cost. And speaking of the top 1%, millions are spent every year on gaming the US News ranking. No surprise here, right? This gaming does little more than improve the ranking and increase the tuition of the university rather than actually delivering results for their actual students. So it doesn't really benefit you as a student, but it benefits the university, and they end up charging more because they are a higher ranking. For example, in 2014, King Abdullah University in Dubai managed to land in 7th place worldwide, worldwide of universities in the US News ranking, just behind Harvard and ahead of Cambridge and MIT. It understood that the US News ranking model used both publications and a researcher's authority, or their H index, in order to determine a university's ranking. So the solution was simple. Just pay top researchers $70,000 a year to spend 3 weeks in a 5-star hotel in Dubai and change their affiliation from whatever it was to King Abdullah University. Now, to be clear, and I want to clarify things today, it doesn't work today. This hack has been patched, and they currently, I was looking at their current US News ranking, and King Abdullah currently ranks 121 out of universities worldwide, which isn't a bad rating, actually. But it's not quite like Harvard, MIT rating, just to be clear. But again, people will discover your model. And when they do, that's how you game the system. It's just a matter of, you know what the model is, or you do some tests, you find out what the model is, and you can game the system 100%. So it is true. Now, let's do a fun exercise. You ready to do one with me? So we're going to come up with a model. Okay, so let's do one kind of on the fly here. Let's pretend we're creating a model for an insurance system. So if we were to come up with a new model for insurance, put in the comments, should we include race? Yes, no? I think if you ask most people, and especially you on the call, I think you're like, I'm preaching to the converted. I would say most people would agree that, come on, that's not a fair thing to include. That's definitely going to create some really bad biases. Great. So next question. Should we include a zip code? Should we put your zip code into the algorithm for insurance? I mean, it's just a number. Might seem fair at first. Well, many are going to come to the conclusion over time, and I imagine you're already there, that this is ultimately going to result in the lower income or the poorer zip codes. They're effectively going to be paying more insurance. And so again, this system is not without bias. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so Alice is saying no. Perfect. Okay, so The problem is it is very hard. Like, let's say you were to come up with one of these models, one of these systems. It's very hard to create a system free of bias. While a first and a last name, like it might seem obvious that that would introduce bias, there are really subtle things, like even the time when you click apply for university, or you click apply for your insurance, for example, might be enough to introduce bias into your system. It's really, really hard to get rid of it. So when we build models, we teach algorithms to discriminate. And the only way to avoid this, or maybe not to avoid, but to improve it, is to have others independently evaluate our systems. And for there to be this constant feedback and iteration. So somebody has to be able to go into the system, be able to test some things out, and then be able to give some recommendations. So for example, Joy Bulamwini, I've spoken about before, her explorations into facial recognition bias against they call it the highly melanated, or just Black people in general, resulted in several big tech companies just saying, okay, we are putting a moratorium. We're going to pause the use of facial recognition technology, at least for a time. And as a result, like, more work is being done to improve it, I hope, before it gets pulled out more broadly. And so I hope that makes sense. It's like, it's not about getting it perfect. It's about being able to get at least enough transparency. I hope that this is what the new EU regulation is going to do for us. It's going to hopefully be a model, kind of like the GDPR was a model for privacy. Some of their model for like AI transparency is going to be a model for us as well. So my main takeaways from this book, and I'm going to go back to the book, was that weapons of math destruction, they take in, maybe this one will be better. Yeah, weapons of math destruction, they take in large amounts of data, and they make decisions that directly impact people's lives with minimal critical thinking and even less opportunity for humane reasoning and exceptions. And it is this lack of critical thinking and feedback that makes these systems so dangerous for our society. It ends up preying on the poorest and most vulnerable. It fuels financial bubbles. It stops people from getting jobs. It results in longer prison sentences, and it hurts the very people educating our children. While weapons of math destruction, or WMDs, have existed for a long time, they are becoming way, way more commonplace. So it's time to move beyond just knowing if news is fake and move towards thinking critically about the math that holds us back, and to see past this mathematical magic show and game the systems for the good of us all. I hope this makes sense. I welcome any questions that you might have about this. I will try to bring up the Amazon Live for you, Alice. But yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Oops. D at A. So let's see. Yes, okay, that worked. Send. Yes, so I'll have to pop it afterwards. No problem. So one thing that I hope that this book review was interesting. I don't often do book reviews, but I like it because I'm like I said, I'm not saying I know all of the stuff related to AI and algorithms. I'm learning just like you guys. But in learning, sometimes I read something, I'm like, oh man, this is so exciting. I can't wait to share it with you guys, because I feel as we learn all of this together, we are all going to be much more prepared for the future. And I did a presentation for the Calgary Public Library on Friday. And it was just about reframing this knowledge. And it was my understanding from this presentation that, like, in marketing, we talk about like different levels of awareness for like market sophistication. And what we learned is that for the most part, what I'm talking about in terms of AI falls into the category of people have no awareness of what this is. And they have no idea, like, why would I be interested in this stuff? But the more that they learn, like once they start learning some of the basics, like, oh, we don't have just like an artificial intelligence. Like, we think that we're not affected by AI, but it turns out everything that we do on the internet is touches AI in one way or another. Like the fact that you flip through your Amazon list, or the fact that you flip through your Facebook, comments, everything like there that you see was all decided by an AI. And those things have an impact on what you buy. They have an impact on what your opinions are. And so that's why I am so excited to share this. And I think that that's something that we all need as a community. And so, so glad to have Alice say, I'm glad you're breaking it down for me. It's not something that I know much about, but your lives give me small chunks to find out more about each week. Yes, yes, that's the objective with these live streams is we want to give you just a little bit of a small nugget, something that you can hopefully take away. And my goal is that every single one of these sessions, there's something practical that you can do. I think really the practical action for this session is go and buy the books. Go and read them. I think that's something that's simple. And then beyond that, I like the exercise that last exercise that I did was from her book. So Kathy O'Neill explained, go and make your own model. Let's go and invent a model that we feel is ideal. And when you start doing this in practice, you start realizing how hard it is. And it's not necessarily that any particular individual is trying to be cruel or mean. They're not trying to harm people on purpose, but that's what happens with these algorithms when we don't think about them critically. And to be fair, like most people do not. There's no financial incentive to do so. So as a result, we get what we get, and we get these algorithms. They make decisions about who gets hired. They make decisions about what we end up seeing, what we end up dating. They impact our universities at like the top level. Universities are trying to game this system as well. Like it's just fascinating. It's just a fascinating area. And so what I want to encourage you, just as kind of like a last maybe call to action, is if you haven't visited the site yet, we have a website called aiparenting.live. And aiparenting.live is just a community. You can sign up for a mail list called the AI Parenting Insider. And what we do is we just send out occasional emails to let you know, hey, by the way, this is where you can get some more information about how parenting or just being part of a family in this world of AI is like, and how we can better thrive. I am very proud to say that I finally have my first fully set up course. It's called Video Funnel Secrets. So it's this untold secret of how to turn attention into leads and into to find out who are the people who are most interested in your message, free without paying for ads. So it's something that I'm pretty excited about. So you can go to aiparenting.live for that. And of course, if you're following on any of your social media, so it could be on Twitter, on LinkedIn, it could be on Facebook or YouTube, you just search AI Parenting. And from AI Parenting, you should be able to, or AI Parenting Live, you should be able to find us directly. And then there's a whole bunch of videos. And people are often wondering, one question was even, how do I get started if I don't know anything about this field? And I would recommend go back to the YouTube and watch. There's a session called Who Created Our Artificial Unconsciousness? And that was kind of a starting point for a lot of my work that explains where we're coming from. This stuff exists. It has existed for a long time. This is this episode that you have here is kind of like an episode number 2 after watching the Who Created Our Artificial Unconsciousness, because it just builds on that. And it just shows that instead of this being unique to our just AI, it's actually like it's been around. Weapons of mass destruction are nothing new. They are a system. They have existed for decades, right? Like, how long have IQ tests been around? And so we use these systems all the time. We use them to evaluate people. We use them to determine job prospects. And yes, when people become aware of the systems and how harmful they are, they go a little bit underground, but we still use them. They don't go away. Like, it feels like they go away, but they don't. And so this is why I think it's very important, if you really want to become aware of how are you being impacted and how is your family being impacted by these algorithms. It doesn't matter if you have kids or not. It's just, if you are a person in society, you are being impacted by weapons of mass destruction and AI. And I am super, super thankful that Kathy O'Neill was able to put these ideas together in this book, many of which I have been reading. There's some other books that I'm really excited about catching up on. And I put some of them, like Algorithms of Oppression was another one that I heard in Coded Bias. So I'm going to be picking that one up as well. And then I recently learned at the Data and AI Summit, which I attended this week, was that like there was one session on the hidden costs of AI. And there was an author, I forgot to write her down her name, but she wrote about what I love is this AI atlas. So she looks at all the different data sources for AI. Where do they come from? What kind of biases they have? And I was like, this is genius. Like, I'm so glad that somebody's done it. Kind of the same way we have an atlas for maps that show us, like, how big is the country? What is the population? What are the critical statistics that you need to know? AI is the same way. So if you look at the NIST database, or if you look at the other types of databases that AI uses as its source, what are the things that we need to be concerned of? So when an AI is trained against NIST, what does that mean? And it will give us a framework for thinking about AIs that will make it easier for us, rather than we have to go and manually test everything. It's like, well, where does the data come from? One of the big shockers, if you don't mind, I'll give you a little teaser, was that in the NIST database, like, they have all these faces of people everywhere. And it's like, where do these faces come from? Like, who consented to give their face to the NIST database, the National Institute of Science and Technology? Well, it turns out most of those images they're mugshots, like people who are arrested, whose freedoms, and in particular freedom to privacy, was taken away from them because they performed a criminal act, and so they don't get those same types of protections. So when you look at these faces, like, what's it trained on? It's mostly people who have been arrested. Like, it could be like potential criminals, or maybe it's at least suspects who have spent some time in jail. And you think about, like, that's the same thing that's being used to, like, recognize faces in a lot of like AI algorithms that are used for people like us today. And so, yeah, maybe it's just expecting, like, an angry face all the time. Maybe that's why it keeps looking for, like, more angry. Like, it looks for, like, when it looks for a face, it's looking for, like, an angry face, not a happy face. And so it's something that the more you know about the back end of the data, the more you're going to be prepared for the types of results that are going to arrive, and the more you're going to be able to control, potentially even potentially game the system. Like, the more that you know the model, the more that you can game the system. It was the same way with YouTube. Like, the moment people found out that all that YouTube cared about was watch time, like, that's when, like, you remember those, like, streamers, like gamers that would play for like 3 hours or something? They just, like, keep playing games. They knew that would be huge for watch time. And then you get people like PewDiePie who boom, they pop up at the very top of the algorithm. They got it. They figured out the algorithm. And that's what this is. Like, for the most part, gaming the system is the name of the game. Right? That's pretty much the only way you can really take back control, is you figure out what it's looking for, and then you start delivering it. That's why, for the most part, people who are really good at AI, they just copy best practices. So you look at what's viral, you look at what's working really well, you try to figure out, oh, what is it doing? How can I make mine look as similar as possible to that? And then the AI has no choice but to do the same, like, oh, make it viral, why not? And so some of the people on YouTube, like you name it, they all do the same thing. TikTok, it's the same. So yeah. Oh, somebody just joined me. Well, I appreciate you joining me live. And I want to say that, reflecting on this time, especially it's like Father's Day, we're thinking about fathers. I think it's important to just keep in mind, like, we're all here, we're all like growing together, we're all struggling, and whatever we can do to help, that's what I'm here for. I'm just trying to make sure that we've got something that is gonna be helpful for the community, and that's my goal. Is I want to just kind of this realization that there's a lot of things that we don't know, and these things that we don't know are hurting us in the end. And so, as much as we can be aware of it, if I can bring more books to you, if I can bring more programs that help improve that awareness, I'm happy to do that. And it's something that I want to see us grow. So anyways, thank you very much. I appreciate you. I think our next live stream, I'm thinking about covering something related to, I want to do it in virtual reality if I can. It's going to be exciting. We'll see if I'm still able to get the person in his name is Brad Wade. He's like huge in this space. So if he's able to do the live stream with me, and I have to check his schedule, I think it'll be wonderful. It'll be an amazing experience for all of us because he's got so many insights into the future of work and where are things going with VR and AR. And to me, I've always been interested in the VR space, but now more so than ever because like it's kind of the next step of where all of this like privacy, this attention, it's where things are going. And the fact that it's all connected to social networks and stuff and all that data is just, to me, really fascinating. Plus, I believe either this week or next week, the F8, so the Facebook's like kind of major tech conference for developers is happening. And like almost always, we see some really exciting announcements related to virtual reality. And so that's something that I'm excited to learn a little bit more about and then share with you my thoughts about, what are the implications of something like that in the future? Okay. Well, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone who was able to join me online. I will speak to you all soon. Take care. We love you and appreciate you, and we will see you next week.